Hi, boys and girls. All right, we finished the first part of Writing Freedom, and we are going to start part two, and it's called In the Middle. So, Charlotte just learned how to drive a team of six horses, and I think she was super proud of herself, especially because she's a girl. Long, long time ago, could girls drive horses and do the same things the boys could? They could not. So, but no one knows she's a boy, except we think maybe Ebenezer might have put it together. Mr. Milshark came and was looking for a girl that ran away, and it was right about the same time that Charlotte or Charlie came to him. So we think maybe Ebenezer knows, but no one else does. So let's find out what happens in the middle. After years of driving hundreds of practice runs with Ebenezer, Charlotte knew how to coddle a coach around any precarious turn. Precarious is a word that kind of means a little dangerous. When she finally did start driving real runs, she learned how to baby the most difficult passengers, and her reputation got her all sorts of requests. If there was an important party, folks wanted the considerate and handsome young driver who had never outturned a coach. Ebenezer just laughed out loud every time a customer insisted on Charlie and no one else. And her disguise? Charlotte carried on a masquerade, same as an actor in a theater play. She dressed carefully, wearing snug undershirts that kept her figure boy-like. She wore loose-fitting pleated flannel shirts with a buckskin vest. She favored baggy trousers, leather boots, and a broad-brimmed hat, and snug buckskin gloves. She kept a snakeskin whip tucked into her belt, and she didn't need to worry about her voice. When she was out with the horses, she practiced speaking low. Maybe it was just because she was so good with those horses, or maybe it was because the townspeople just didn't pay much mind. But Ebenezer's clean-shaven young driver with the warm, raspy voice just didn't arouse any suspicion. Charlotte was acting, dressing, and talking like a first-rate stage driver, so in folks' eyes, that's what she was. Anyway, Charlotte was careful to protect her identity. She didn't bunk with the other stable hands, still preferring to sleep in the loft. And for that, they teased her, something fierce about loving horses more than people. She was even cautious about the letters she wrote to Hayward. Instead of mailing them herself, she had other drivers mail them from towns all over the Atlantic coast, and she had him write to her in care of Ebenezer's stables. Now and then Hayward would send word that he had ridden over near Concord and stopped at the orphanage to let Vern know about her whereabouts. The word of encouragement that Vern sent back through Hayward always made her smile. For 6 years she managed to steer clear of Mr. Milshark. She was 18 and fully grown, but she was still a young woman doing a man's work. If she was ever found out, her job could end in a moment's recognition, and all of her dreams along with it. So it sounds like she's doing pretty good. It sounds like she is figuring out how to work for Ebenezer and drive the horses, and no one's really suspicious of her at all, but she knows that if one person says something, if one person recognizes her, then her whole career, her whole life could change. Okay. Chapter 6. So Charlotte's afraid that with just one person's recognition, everything she has worked hard for could disappear. That would be scary, living a lie, kind of, knowing that if anyone noticed who you really were, that you could lose everything that you had. That would be pretty scary. What Stables in Providence, Rhode Island, teemed with activity. There were plenty of passengers to carry, as well as parcels of mail and strong boxes from the bank. Charlotte settled into a busy routine, caring for her horses and for her passengers. She was partial to the women and children, always respectful and giving them the best seats. The occasional grumbling men didn't complain too much, because the talk was they were riding with the best and safest driver on the whole Atlantic coast. Charlotte didn't Charlotte didn't have much time for cause for worry, until one morning when Ebenezer handed her the manifest with the list of passengers. She froze at the name before her. It couldn't be the same Mr. Millshark, could it? Carefully, Charlotte peeked from under her hat and studied the group of people standing near the ticket office. There was a group of women, 2 children, and 1 gentleman. The gentleman was Mr. Millshark, one and the same, dressed in a handsome gray suit, but something was peculiar about him. He had grown taller, much taller. Then Charlotte noticed the fancy boots with high heels that made him look bigger than he actually was. So it's Mr. Millshark. Oh no, what is Charlotte going to do? Suddenly, Charlotte felt 12 years old again. She knew she'd never have to go back to the orphanage, but her heart told her that there was more at stake. If he discovered her, he'd make sure people knew who she was and what she'd done. Once word got out, it wouldn't matter how old she was or how good a driver. Customers wouldn't ride with a woman. When Ebenezer saw Charlotte standing still, he said, "Charlie, get to work." "I'll get the rear boot," said Charlotte, and she began loading the baggage in the leather storage behind the coach. She tied the overflow baggage on the roof of the carriage, double and triple checking the knots. She felt jittery, and her forehead broke out in beads of sweat. She took out her kerchief and dabbed at her brow. Ebenezer handed her the paperwork. "You look like you seen a ghost," he said. "I don't think I can drive today." "What are you blabbering about? The mail's got to go through, same as them passengers." Then Ebenezer looked over at Mr. Millshark. He studied the man, and after a while a feeling of recognition settled over him. Could it really be the same man from an orphanage who had come looking for a runaway girl some years ago? Ebenezer put his hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Now listen, don't you pay them passengers no mind. You are what you are, and what you are is a fine horseman, and the best coachman I ever saw. You remember that. Under the circumstances, there ain't nothing left for you to do but your job, so get to it." Charlotte looked square at Ebenezer. Ebenezer looked square back at Charlotte and said, "You're the coachman. You're in charge, so load 'em up." Charlotte pulled her hat down low over her face and tied her kerchief over her nose. She hoped Ebenezer was right. "All aboard!" she yelled. Charlotte seated the women first and put them by the windows. Those were the best seats. Then she put in the children. "Do you have a seat for me, good man?" asked Mr. Millshark. "You can squeeze in on the middle bench with them children," said Charlotte. "Could I persuade you with a few fine cigars to let me sit up top, since I am just going to the next town?" he asked. Oh, so he wants to sit up top with Charlotte, right next to Charlotte. Charlotte hesitated. She didn't want to argue with Mr. Millshark any more than she had to, and any reputable stage driver would never turn down a handful of cigars. "Certainly," she said stiffly, and climbed into the box seat, keeping her head turned away. Pleased with himself, Mr. Millshark climbed up and sat next to Charlotte. "Thank you," he said. "It'll be a pleasurable ride for sure." 2 stock tenders brought the lead horses out, positioned them in the traces, and handed the ribbons to Charlotte. Next came the swings, the middle horses in the lineup, and last came the wheelers, the horses closest to the wheels. The stock tenders released the leaders. "Get along, my beauties!" yelled Charlotte. With a flick of her wrist, the stagecoach lurched forward, and Charlotte carefully maneuvered the stage out of town. She allowed the horses to pick up speed. The coach began rollicking across the countryside, veering down the dusty road. The thorough braces, 3-inch strap of leather hooked to the axles, cradled the carriage like a baby in a hammock. The coach rocked back and forth. The passengers on the inside bounced around on padded seats, but up top, where Charlotte and Mr. Millshark sat, there was nothing but a wooden bench. Mr. Millshark wedged into the corner of the box seat, held onto his hat with one hand, and clutched the narrow rail with the other. Charlotte knew every twist in the road. She knew when she could speed up and when she could hold back. She remembered Ebenezer's words, "You are a fine horseman and the best coachman I ever saw." "Going a little fast, aren't you?" yelled Mr. Milshark. "I know my horses by heart, and I'm not the one for bad driving, so hold tight," hollered Charlotte. Nervously, he said, "You're the boss." "Giddy up," she yelled, giving the horses more rein and enjoying this moment, this power over Milshark. She loved the thrill of being the master of her team. Charlotte looked at him. He seemed pitiful, hanging onto the rails for dear life. Why, she wasn't even going that fast. She knew which roads might be flooded after a rain, which might be cluttered with branches after a storm, and which were muddy. A few days earlier, on this same road, she got stuck in a mud bog near Jensen's farm. Today she would have to go around by another road to miss the bog. But suddenly she felt some childish urge for revenge and had an idea. She gave the team a loud whistle and drove them directly toward the middle of the bog, just like a muddy area. The stagecoach mired in the doughy mud, but Charlotte wasn't worried. The passengers weren't in any danger, and she'd still get them to their stop on time. "Well, if that don't beat all," said Charlotte. "We're stuck," said Mr. Milshark. "Let's get her out. You get some brush under her wheels so I can guide her to the other side," said Charlotte. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Milshark. "I'm the only one who can drive this team. Them women in the coach are only good for cooking and sewing. I need a strong man to help me, or else we might be here till this mud dries up. I'd recommend taking off those fancy boots and them fine stockings, though." So Charlotte drove the horses into the mud on purpose. And now she's saying the women can't help because they're just women. The only thing they know how to do is sew and cook. Is that true? And she's asking Mr. Milshark to get out in the mud to help her get the horses unstuck. Do you really think she needs Mr. Milshark's help? Mr. Milshark reluctantly peeled them off his boots and stockings and got down from the coach. He sank in the mud up to his ankles. He picked up his feet slowly, sinking further into the mud with each step. He dragged some tree branches over and placed them under the wheels of the stagecoach. Inside the coach was cozy, paneled with basswood and lit with oil lanterns with brass fittings. The small windows had leather shades that could be pulled up or down to protect the passengers from weather or dust. "Pull down those window shades, ladies," Charlotte yelled. "Don't want you to get muddy." Trying not to chuckle, Charlotte stayed up in the box seat and worked the horses back and forth. Each time the wheels turned, Mr. Milshark got sprayed with mud. Finally, Charlotte maneuvered the stage out of the bog and waited farther up the road than she needed to for Mr. Milshark to catch up. So she's stuck in the mud with the horses, and the wheels are just spinning and spinning because of the mud. And every time they spin, Mr. Milshark in back gets sprayed with the mud from the horses. Once she finally gets the horses out of the mud, she parks down the road a ways, so Mr. Milshark has to walk. "Good man," said Charlie. "Thank you." Mr. Milshark climbed up top but didn't say a word. On the way to the next town, Charlotte drove as fast as was safe. When she glanced at Mr. Milshark, he looked pale as milk. It was an hour later when Charlotte stopped the stage. "Well, here we are, the first stop," she said. "My boots," said Mr. Milshark. Charlotte looked around. "They were here, sure as I'm here," said Charlotte. "They must have dropped out on the way. That's a pity. Well, I suppose we could go back and take a look for them." "No," said Mr. Milshark. "I mean, no need." He held out a coin and said, "If you see those boots again, I'd appreciate you retrieving them. They were specially ordered. Very expensive." "Yes, sir," said Charlotte. She took the coin and hopped down from the seat. She pulled off the kerchief from her face and busied herself with the baggage. Mr. Milshark was covered with a dried crust of mud and still complaining about his sore bottom and his lost boots. He climbed down and came over to Charlotte. Charlotte looked at him, nodded, and handed him his bags. A glimmer of recognition crossed Mr. Milshark's face. "You look familiar," he said. Oh, that's what lots of folks say, said Charlotte as she hopped back up in the box seat and readied the horses before he could respond. Mr. Milshark had a puzzled look on his face as he walked barefooted into the hotel, and hidden in the leather storage were a new pair of boots for Ebenezer. So Charlotte didn't lose his boots. She's just keeping them. Oh, there's a picture of Charlotte and the boots.